Just after midnight on August 31st, 2001, 36-year-old Dana Laskowski sat on her couch sipping a drink at her home in Puyallup, Washington, which is about 35 miles outside of Seattle. Dana had been enjoying a night at home by herself, but as she sat there on the couch, the silence in the house started to feel a bit unsettling. It just was not something she'd gotten used to yet. Dana was the mother of 9-year-old triplets, so the house was typically filled with a lot of noise. But tonight, the kids were 3 hours away staying with their dad. Dana and her husband Stan had separated the previous year, and after the separation, Dana had moved several hours away to Puyallup, where some of her family lived. Dana and Stan had tried hard to effectively co-parent the triplets. She loved the idea. She loved that the kids still had a good relationship with their father, but not having them around all the time had been a huge transition for Dana. Dana grabbed the remote off the coffee table and turned on the TV, just to have some background noise. She sipped her drink and then kind of laughed at herself. Spending a night on her own really should not be that big of a deal. It should be fun, it should be enjoyable. And plus, even though her triplets would be gone for a few more days still, Dana worked as a nanny for a couple in town, and she'd be able to spend time with their kids, who she loved too. And so Dana told herself to just relax and enjoy a stress-free night. Then she leaned back on the couch and tried to watch TV. But as she was doing that, she suddenly heard this noise coming from the back of the house. She put her drink down, turned off the TV, and then walked out of the room towards the back door. She expected to see her 17-year-old niece and Amanda's best friend, Emily Lauenborg, standing in the hall, because Dana always kept her back door unlocked for these two teenage girls. Amanda and Emily both had strained relationships with their families, so Dana had become a kind of surrogate mother to both of them. She let them use her house to do laundry, take showers, or to just have a place they could come where they would feel taken care of. But when Dana reached the back of the house, she didn't see the girls standing in the hall. She walked to the back door and glanced outside onto the back porch, but she didn't see anybody there either. She figured she must be hearing things. Being home alone could do that after all. So she left the back door unlocked in case the girls did show up later, and then turned back around and headed back to the couch. Even though it was late, Dana suddenly thought about giving her niece a call, just to check in on her. The last time she'd seen Amanda and her friend Emily, they had been spending almost all their time with this group of teenage guys who called themselves the Park Rats, because they always hung around at the same public park. Dana tried to keep an open mind and not judge, but she couldn't help but worry about two young women spending time with a group of guys who did not seem to have any ambition in life. And she knew for a fact that some of the Park Rats had pretty serious drug problems. On top of that, Amanda and Emily were both relatively small girls, and Dana knew they really couldn't protect themselves if any of the guys ever tried to get physical with them. Dana sat down on the couch, still debating if she should call Amanda. However, before she could make up her mind, she heard something at the back door again. Then she heard footsteps coming down the hall. At 10:30 a.m. the following morning, a patrol officer from the Puyallup Police Department pulled up in front of Dana's house. He'd gotten a message from dispatch about an urgent 911 call that had come in that morning. A woman had called and said her children's nanny, Dana Laskowski, had not arrived at the house when she was supposed to. The woman and her husband had both called Dana, but couldn't get a hold of her. And this really worried them, because Dana would never not show up without calling and making sure the kids would be okay. So the woman had asked the police to please do a wellness check on Dana. The officer stepped out of his cruiser and glanced around the neighborhood. This was a pretty busy area of town, with lots of fast food restaurants and shops nearby, so the street could see plenty of traffic at night. The officer walked up to Dana's front door and knocked while calling out her name and also introducing himself. But after a few moments, he didn't get a response, and he also didn't hear any movement inside the house. And so eventually, the officer walked around to the side of the house and pressed his face against a window. However, the curtains inside the house made it difficult to see anything inside. So he walked around to the back of the house, and there he noticed the back door was cracked open. He slowly walked up the steps of the old wooden porch, approached the door, and then called out for Dana again through the crack. But there was still no response. The officer tensed up. He had no idea if this was an innocent mistake by Dana leaving the store open, or if maybe somebody had broken into her house. And if it was the latter, the intruder could still be inside. And so the officer unholstered his gun, pushed the door open, and stepped into the house. As he did this, he walked past an open door and glanced inside. It was a bedroom, and it looked like it had been ransacked. Dresser drawers were open and clothes had been thrown all over the floor, but he didn't see anybody in the room. And so the officer kept heading down the hallway, getting more and more tense as he moved. He eventually reached the front room and stepped inside. And there he found more pieces of clothing on the floor, but he still didn't see anybody. The officer reached for his radio, about to call in a potential burglary, when he looked over at the couch. And immediately, what he saw there told him he was dealing with something far worse than just a break-in. A little later that morning, veteran homicide detective Scott Bramhall of the Puyallup Police Department arrived at Dana's house. He saw a patrol officer standing out front, waiting for him. Bramhall could tell this officer was shaken up by what he'd found inside. Detective Bramhall talked to the officer and got as much information as he could, then he put on his gloves and stepped inside. Bramhall walked into the front room of the house and immediately saw what had upset the patrol officer. The dead body of a woman lay on the couch, with a blanket partially covering her legs, almost like she'd been keeping her feet warm. The patrol officer had found a photo ID during his search, and he had positively identified the woman as Dana Laskowski, the woman he had come to do the wellness check on. Detective Bramhall approached Dana's body and crouched down beside it. Right away, he saw specks of blood on her cheeks and mouth, as well as blood on the carpet by the couch. He also saw deep, dark bruises and ligature marks on Dana's throat. Bramhall looked around the room and saw a scarf on the floor not far from the couch. And his first thought was Dana had most likely been strangled to death, and that scarf could very well be the murder weapon. But the position Dana was lying in was by far the most shocking thing about this crime scene. Dana's head rested on one of her arms, but her other arm was bent at a strange angle behind her back, and her waist was twisted in an awkward position, like her body was contorted. The result of all this was that even in death, Dana appeared like she was actively in some kind of physical struggle. Just then, the detective heard voices and footsteps behind him. He stood up and turned to see more police officers and a small group of forensic technicians walking into the room. Bramhall waved one of the forensic techs over, and the two of them began examining Dana's body together. The tech agreed that Dana had most likely been strangled to death, and the severity of the wounds on her throat indicated that whoever had killed her was pretty strong. Also, Detective Bramhall knew that in a lot of cases of strangulation, the victim fights back really aggressively, thrashing and fighting as much as they can, giving further credibility to the idea that Dana's killer really did have to be big and strong to be able to overpower her. After a few moments, Bramhall left the forensic tech and searched the rest of the house with a few other officers. He told a member of his team to get started on a background check for Dana, while other officers went out to speak with Dana's neighbors to see if any of them had seen or heard something strange that morning or the night before. As the detective made his way through Dana's house, it was clear the place had been ransacked. However, he noticed that some pretty obviously expensive items like a computer and other electronics had been left untouched. This could mean a couple of different things. Either someone had robbed Dana's house looking for something specific, like jewelry, or this entire scene had been staged to look like a robbery. Another thing that stood out to Bramhall was that even though Dana's body and the blood indicated a struggle, there was no sign of forced entry. The back door had been open and unlocked when the patrol officer had first arrived on the scene, and the front door had been locked and showed no signs of a break-in. So Bramhall wondered if Dana had let her killer inside, or if they had unlocked the back door with their own key. As Bramhall was searching the house, one of his team members came up to him. This officer told him that he'd only just started looking into Dana's background, but already he'd found something important. She and her husband Stan were recently separated, and Stan was not answering his phone. That night, after Detective Bramhall had spent hours at Dana's house, he got back to the police station, and he was already feeling antsy. Dana's husband, Stan, like any murder victim's spouse, would basically automatically be a major suspect under almost any circumstance. However, in the few hours since Bramhall had begun working this case, Stan had started to look like the perfect suspect. Stan had not responded to the multiple calls the Puyallup police had made throughout the day, and when Detective Bramhall had reached out to police in the town where Stan lived, they actually went by his house, and there had been no sign of Stan or the triplets. Now, Detective Bramhall did not want to jump to conclusions here. However, he couldn't ignore what might be going on here. A man killing his estranged wife so he could have sole custody of their kids was actually a fairly common thing. Still, Bramhall couldn't do anything until they actually tracked Stan down. So, the detective stayed in touch with the police in Stanstown, and he also contacted the Washington State Police to tell them to be on the lookout for Stan. In the meantime, Bramhall started to gather information on Dana's friends, family, and her employers. Now, he was already planning on interviewing everybody close to Dana, but if Stan didn't turn up soon, he hoped maybe one of them would be able to help police track him down. But the following morning, before Bramhall had met with anybody else, he got a phone call in his office. And as soon as he answered, he heard the voice of a man who sounded upset and a bit frightened. It was Dana's husband, Stan. Stan explained that he had just taken his kids camping and had been at a spot out in the woods that didn't get cell service. So when he'd left the campsite earlier that morning, he saw he had tons of voice messages from the police. And when he had called the cops back, he learned that his estranged wife had been murdered. And then after that, the police had connected him to Detective Bramhall. There was no question in Bramhall's mind that Stan was a major suspect. However, if Stan was innocent, Bramhall could not imagine a worse way to have gotten such horrific news. Bramhall told Stan they needed to talk right now in person, and so Bramhall said he would just drive over to Stan's house right now. Stan said okay, and so Detective Bramhall hung up and then told members of his team to begin looking into Dana's friends and family. Then Bramhall got in touch with the local police where Stan lived to say he was going there to interview him, and then he headed out. The 5-hour drive led Bramhall through the woods and hills of the Pacific Northwest, and as he drove, it hit Bramhall just how slow-going this trip really was. He wondered if Stan had gotten angry about having to make this drive just to see his kids. Maybe he'd gone to Dana's house and confronted her about it. If they'd gotten into a fight, Stan could have flown into a rage and killed her. Now, this was just a theory, but when Bramhall finally got to Stan's house along with a local officer and they met Stan at the front door, Bramhall's theory didn't seem too far-fetched. Because Stan was a big guy. He could have easily overpowered Dana. But more importantly, Bramhall noticed right away that Stan had scrape marks on both of his legs, a sign that perhaps he had a recent physical altercation with someone. Stan led Bramhall and the other officer into his house, and they all sat down together in the kitchen. Bramhall didn't waste any time. He asked Stan flat out if he and Dana had been arguing about their separation, and if that tension had led to any physical altercations. Stan immediately shook his head and said no. He didn't deny that he and Dana argued, and that being separated and trying to co-parent triplets could be stressful, but he said he and Dana had worked hard to help each other and to support each other, and to make their kids' lives as normal as possible. Bramhall immediately changed the subject, and asked Stan how he'd gotten those scrapes on his legs. Stan looked a little surprised by the question, but he said he'd gotten them while playing baseball. Bramhall jotted it down in his notebook, having no sense of whether or not he was actually getting the truth. Finally, Bramhall asked Stan if he'd be willing to submit a DNA sample. And at that, Stan's whole demeanor changed. He'd been cooperative the entire time, but now he said there was no way he was going to provide DNA. He still didn't really know what was going on here, and he hadn't even talked to a lawyer. Bramhall knew he couldn't force Stan to give them a DNA sample, not yet at least. He also knew a lot of people, even innocent people, didn't like the idea of providing their DNA. So Bramhall stood up, said he'd check into Stan's camping trip alibi, and that he'd be in touch. Hours later, Bramhall made it back to the station, and he felt like nothing had really changed regarding Stan. Stan was still a major suspect, and since he hadn't provided a DNA sample, the police would just have to keep digging into his alibi and his background to see if they could find anything that directly connected him to the murder. However, within minutes of getting back to the police station, one of Bramhall's team members came into his office and told him he had a major new lead. Detective Bramhall was worn out from all that driving he'd just done, but he felt an instant rush when he heard this. He asked the officer what he'd found. The officer said he'd spoken to the couple who employed Dana as their nanny, and they said Dana had a stalker, a guy named William. And Dana had even said to her employers that if she ever turned up dead, William would be the one who had killed her. On the evening of September 2nd, 2 days after Dana's body had been found, Detective Bramhall sat inside of an interview room across the table from Dana's alleged stalker, William. It would turn out William had installed cabling at Dana's house a few months earlier. And since then, he'd been leaving notes and poems on Dana's front door, and he'd been seen lurking around her house a bunch of times by several of Dana's neighbors. Police also found a string of harassing messages from William on Dana's phone. And so all of that had been enough for Bramhall to secure a search warrant, and the search of William's house had led to a disturbing discovery. Inside the interview room, Detective Bramhall pulled out a notebook and put it on the table. Then he asked William if he recognized it. William lowered his head and then nodded. He said it was his personal journal. Bramhall flipped open the notebook and showed William what appeared to be a letter to an unnamed woman. And this letter was filled with all these violent things William wanted to do to her. Bramhall flipped to another page, which was another letter to this same unnamed woman, filled with even more anger and more threats of violence. And so Detective Bramhall said it looked to him like William had been obsessed with Dana, leaving her notes and poetry and spying on her at her house. And when Dana didn't reciprocate, he got angry and started fantasizing about hurting her and began writing about it in his journal. But as William heard this, he just shook his head and said, "No, it's not like that at all." William said those letters were an exercise his therapist had told him to do, and they weren't even about Dana. He said he had written that stuff about a woman who'd broken his heart, but it was just to get out the anger and hurt that he felt. He would never actually do any of the stuff he had written. Bramhall sat there in silence for a minute, just looking at the man across the table. Like Dana's husband, William was easily big enough to have overpowered Dana. And even if William was telling the truth about the notebook, he clearly had some kind of unhealthy obsession with Dana. So Bramhall leaned in and told William there was a really easy way for him to clear his name and help the police figure out what happened to Dana. William could provide the police with his phone and a DNA sample. And William didn't hesitate. He said he would do whatever the police needed, anything that would show he did not hurt Dana. In the days following the interview with William, Detective Bramhall and his team met with more of Dana's friends and family. Bramhall had two solid suspects, Stan, the estranged husband, and William the stalker. But he still didn't have any clear evidence pointing to either of them. And most of the people he spoke to didn't provide much more information. But Bramhall eventually met with Dana's 17-year-old niece Amanda at her house, and she told him something that had the potential to turn his whole investigation on its head. Amanda told Bramhall that Dana was like a second mother to her and her best friend Emily. Dana let them come over whenever they wanted, and the house was like this great escape for them. Amanda said Dana even left her back door unlocked, just so they could come in whenever they wanted to. This was a huge piece of news for Bramhall. It now made sense how somebody could have gotten into Dana's house without actually having to break in. They just walked in the unlocked back door. But then Amanda said something else that seemed even bigger. She explained that she and Emily had become friends with a bunch of teenagers who called themselves the Park Rats. And Bramhall knew exactly who they were, and he knew some of them were bad news. More than a few Park Rats had ended up in jail for drugs and violent crimes. And so as soon as Bramhall heard this, he asked Amanda if any of the Park Rats knew that her aunt kept her back door unlocked, and Amanda nodded and said yes. She said she had actually brought a couple of the park rats to Dana's house to meet her, just because Amanda thought Dana was so good at taking care of people who didn't really have anybody else, and most of the park rats had very difficult home lives. Detective Bramhall left Amanda's house and laid out his next steps. So far, his case had seemed like a pretty straightforward case. Estranged husbands and stalkers were common suspects. But now, he and his team were going to have to track down and interrogate a local gang of teenagers. Finding the park rats didn't prove to be too difficult for Detective Bramhall. A few trips to the public park where they hung out and meeting with a couple members of the group who were now in jail was really all it took. But getting the park rats to actually give him useful information turned out to be a lot harder. Most of them said they knew about Dana's murder, but all of them denied having anything to do with it. And since Bramhall didn't have any evidence connecting these teenagers to the scene, he couldn't just arrest them and try to force them to talk. And so, before long, a month had just flown by, and Bramhall still didn't have anything. And in that time, no new evidence surfaced that pointed to either Dana's husband Stan or the stalker William. And so Bramhall began to worry that maybe Dana's death had been the result of a random burglary gone wrong, and that the police were not even close to tracking down her killer. On October 4th, 2001, so 34 days after Dana's murder, her friends and family finally gathered for her funeral. Because of the ongoing investigation, police had waited longer than usual to release the body back to the family. But now, a funeral home in town was packed with people who had come to express how much they loved and missed Dana, and how much she had been there for them. Detective Bramhall and some members of his team attended the funeral, watching to see if anyone might do something that jumped out at them. But nothing out of the ordinary happened. It was just a group of people grieving the loss of a loved one. After the service was over, Bramhall secured the funeral memorial book, which had been signed by the people who had attended. Bramhall hoped that he could find someone in this book that could maybe offer his investigation a new lead. So Bramhall and his team brought the book back to the station and they went through it, and as they did, they saw some people, in addition to signing it, also left written notes. And one of these written notes totally floored Bramhall. After reading the notes several times, Bramhall felt confident he had just found a massive clue. Bramhall and his team quickly met with the person who had written this note, and what that person said led police right back to the park rats. Over the next several weeks, armed with new information from this memorial book, Detective Bramhall tracked down several of the park rats he'd already met with, and they were willing to cooperate. All of them still maintained they had nothing to do with Dana's murder, but they said there was somebody the police needed to talk to. It was someone they all knew, and who they called the Mutant. Bramhall thought the Mutant definitely sounded like a nickname a group of teenagers would come up with, like something out of a comic book. But the park rats said the Mutant was more like a name for a professional wrestler, because the Mutant was really strong and loved to wrestle. And like all professional wrestlers, the Mutant had a signature move: choking their opponent, twisting them at the waist, and bending their arm all the way behind their back. When Detective Bramhall heard about this signature wrestling move, immediately images of the bizarre position he'd found Dana's body in ran through his mind. And so, the detective and his team spent the next several days compiling background information, and then they brought the Mutant in for an interview. And by the end of that interview, Detective Bramhall knew who had killed Dana Laskowski. Based on information from the Mutant, evidence found at the crime scene, and interviews conducted throughout the investigation, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Dana not long after midnight on August 31st, 2001. That night, the killer and their partner moved quietly through the darkness towards the back door of Dana's house. Once they got there, they opened it up, walked inside, and began walking down the hallway towards the front room. When they got there, they saw Dana standing by the couch, but before she could say anything, the killer demanded that Dana give them some money. Dana stayed calm and said she was sorry but didn't have any money, but the killer immediately snapped back and said Dana needed to hand over some cash right now. Dana repeated that she didn't have any money, and then she asked the killer and their partner to please just leave, but the killer wasn't having it. They walked over to Dana, they grabbed her and shouted that they wanted her money now. Dana tried to push the killer off, but the killer was too strong. Dana screamed, and this only set off the killer even more. They hit Dana in the face and then slammed her to the floor. Dana tried to get up off the floor, but the killer just leapt on top of her and rolled her over onto her stomach. Then the killer saw one of Dana's scarves laying on the arm of the couch, and they grabbed it. Then, before Dana could do anything, they wrapped that scarf around Dana's neck and began choking her. Dana kicked and flailed, but the killer fought off her attack, while the killer's partner just stood there, watching. The killer kept choking Dana with the scarf in one hand, and then with their other hand, they grabbed Dana's arm and they yanked it violently backwards, twisting her around at the waist. Dana tried to scream louder, but now she was gasping for air, and slowly Dana's eyes went wide and she stopped breathing, and she died right there on the floor. The killer let go of the scarf and Dana's arm, and they stood up. They stared down at Dana's body, and then over at their partner, who was still just standing there in a daze. Then the killer picked Dana up. The scarf fell to the floor as the killer laid Dana on the couch, still in her twisted position with her arm pinned behind her back. The killer then grabbed a folded-up blanket from the edge of the couch and covered Dana's feet and part of her legs with it, almost like they were tucking her in. But after the killer stepped away from the couch and kind of surveyed the scene, it was like they began to panic. They yelled at their partner that they needed to make this look like a robbery. The two of them quickly ran to Dana's bedroom and threw open all the drawers and littered the floor with clothing. They also carried some more clothes into the front room and dumped those on the floor as well. And then they ran out of the room, down the hall, and out the back door. The same back door that Dana had always left unlocked just for them, so they could always come to her house to escape their troubles at home. The people responsible for Dana's murder were Dana's own niece, Amanda, and Amanda's best friend, Emily Lauenborg, who all of the park rats knew as the mutant. The two young women had gone to Dana's house to try to get Dana to give them some money, and when she refused, it was Emily, the mutant, who attacked and killed her. Emily had not been high on the suspect list because on the surface, she did not fit the profile of the killer. Police had assumed that the killer was a man who was bigger and stronger than Dana, and Emily was a small young woman who was only about 5'2". But it would turn out, despite her small size, Emily was extremely strong and loved to wrestle, hence how she got the nickname the Mutant. The note that Detective Bramhall saw in Dana's funeral memorial book that really stood out to him was written by Dana's niece, Amanda. And it read, "I'm sorry I wasn't a better niece for you. 34 days clean and sober. It's all for you." The funeral was held exactly 34 days after Dana's murder, suggesting Dana's murder prompted Amanda to go sober on that same day. Now, that in and of itself is not totally unreasonable, that a death in the family would prompt a big life change. However, to Bramhall, as he was reading through the notes, that note just felt weirdly specific to reference her sobriety and the exact number of days inside of this memorial book when all the other notes were just far less specific. And so to him, something felt off about it. And so the detective followed up with Amanda and asked her about the note, and she would admit to him that she had been struggling with drug addiction. And so Bramhall wanted to know if her sudden sobriety was connected to Dana's murder, like the note implied. And Amanda would say yes, and over the course of this discussion, she would also just tell Bramhall that there was this drug dealer in the park rats who might have killed her aunt. However, when Bramhall met with that drug dealer and several other members of the park rats, they all pointed the finger at Emily, the mutant. Police searched Emily's house and found a piece of paper in her room. On it, she had written a list of goals she had. And one of those goals was to, quote, kill someone and get away with it. Emily eventually confessed to the murder, and Amanda admitted to being in the house during the murder. Dana's niece Amanda aided the police in prosecution, and so she was not charged with any crime. As for Emily, she would take a plea deal and would only serve about 5.5 years in prison. Just after midnight on June 22, 1991, Charles Holden was on his way home from work when he decided to stop at a fast food restaurant near his house in Harrington, Delaware. After grabbing a quick bite to eat, Charles left the store and got back in his truck. He turned it on and he was about to drive out of the lot when he stopped because there was this man running towards him, waving, trying to flag him down. So Charles put his truck back in park and he rolled his window down to see what this guy wanted. And when this stranger got close enough, he told Charles that his sister was having a baby and he needed a ride to the hospital, which was about 20 minutes away. Charles couldn't tell if this guy was lying. It was super late. He didn't know this guy, and he just had a bad feeling about him. And so he told him, "No, I'm sorry. It's too late. I gotta get home. It's too far out of the way." The stranger immediately looked dejected and turned around and started walking away. And as Charles was watching him go, he felt bad and said, "You know what? Hey, come back here. I'll give you a ride part of the way there." And so the stranger smiled, hopped in his passenger seat, and they took off. Charles drove him approximately 3 miles in the direction he had asked to go before pulling over on the side of the road and telling him, "This is as far as I'm going to take you." Charles lived only about a block away and he didn't want to drive too far away from home so late at night. But the stranger, upon hearing he was being let out so soon, suddenly became angry and began fumbling in his pocket like he was going to get a knife or some sort of weapon, and he starts screaming at Charles, "Hand over your keys, hand over your wallet, or I'm going to kill you." Charles, meanwhile, was on edge just being in the car with this guy because he had a bad feeling about him, and so he immediately jumped into action. He turned off his truck, he ripped the keys out of the ignition, and he leapt out of his truck and started running. Charles saw way off in the distance was a convenience store, and he figured he could run to there and get some help. But as he's running, he turns around and sees the stranger has also leapt out of the car and was now sprinting up to him with a screwdriver in his hand. And this stranger was running really fast. He was gaining on Charles. And soon Charles realized he wasn't going to make it to the convenience store before this guy caught up to him. And so at some point, Charles just stops, he turns around and he puts his hands up and he says, okay, I'll give you a ride wherever you want to go. And then you can have my keys, my wallet, you can have anything you want. And so the stranger runs right up to Charles and he stops and he smiles because he's very pleased with this result. And he pokes him with the screwdriver and kind of gestures for him to go back to the truck. So Charles walks back to the truck with the stranger right behind him with the screwdriver periodically poking him in the back. They finally get to the vehicle and the stranger tells Charles to get in the car and then wait. But as soon as Charles sat down, he fired up his truck and sped off before the stranger could hop in the passenger side door. And so Charles is flying away from this guy. He looks in his rearview mirror and he can see the guy is chasing after him with a screwdriver held over his head, but he sees the stranger at some point just stops, turns around, and walks away. Charles was totally relieved that he had escaped this horrible encounter, and he was thinking about calling the police, but ultimately decided he wouldn't because it was his decision to allow some stranger to get in his car in the middle of the night. And so Charles kind of blamed himself for the whole ordeal. What Charles was concerned about, though, was where he had ditched the stranger was not far from his house, and he was worried if he just turned around and drove right back to his house, that this guy could recognize the truck and then follow him to his house, and then who knows what could happen. And so Charles decides he's just going to stay outside of town and drive around for a while to make sure this stranger is long gone by the time he comes back. So after about an hour of doing just that, driving around outside of town, Charles goes back into Harrington, Delaware, and he gets on his street, and he's shocked when he sees the stranger who had just tried to kill him is walking down the road right in front of him. But luckily, the stranger did not hear or see Charles pull onto his street, and so Charles immediately throws it in reverse and he gets out of there and he drives off. At this point, Charles decides he needs to tell police because he doesn't know if this stranger actually knows him and that maybe he's targeting him and he's waiting for him at his property. And so he calls 911 and he tells the dispatcher about what had happened earlier and how this guy is now lurking around his property. And the dispatcher tells him they'll send an officer out to him. And so a few minutes later, an officer showed up at the payphone where Charles was, and they told Charles they would escort him back to his property. And if the stranger was still out in the area, they would arrest him. And so the two of them made their way back to Charles's property. They get there, the stranger's long gone, and then Charles goes into his house. There's no sign of a break-in. There's no sign that anyone was near his property. And so Charles thanks the officer. He feels totally relieved. But before the officer leaves, he asks him if he wouldn't mind doing a quick sweep of his mother's property. She lived right behind Charles on the other side of some bushes. He told the officer her name was Dorothy, she was 70 years old, and she lived alone, and he just wanted to make sure nothing happened to her. So the officer said, "No problem, I'll go check in on her." So the officer leaves Charles and goes across his backyard through those bushes into Dorothy's backyard, and right away he can see the back window on the back door has been smashed and the door itself is slightly ajar. And so the officer draws their pistol and they go up and they enter the house and they look inside. They're yelling for Dorothy, but there's no answer. It's totally dark in the house. It's totally silent. And so after searching the first floor and finding nothing, they make their way up the flight of stairs and they find blood at the top of the landing. And they follow this trail of blood and it brings them into one of the bedrooms where a woman is sprawled out on a bed. It was Dorothy. She had been stabbed to death. It would turn out, after Charles had ditched the stranger and sped off without him, the stranger, whose name was Gilbert Cannon, began looking for a place to sleep, and the house he ultimately selected just happened to be Charles's mother's house. After Gilbert broke in through her back door, he saw Dorothy coming down the steps to confront him, and because he was worried she'd be able to identify him, he attacked her with a screwdriver. Gilbert would later tell police that the attack on Charles was completely random. He was just at this fast food restaurant, he saw Charles get into his truck, and he thought to himself, if I can get in that guy's truck, I bet I can rob him. And then after this failed robbery, when Gilbert is out looking for a place to sleep and he breaks into this house, and this woman comes down the stairs that he attacks and kills, he has no idea that this woman, Dorothy, is Charles's mother. The entire night was one big, horrible coincidence. Gilbert would plead guilty to the murder and would be sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Our next story is called That Didn't Age Well. On the evening of January 6, 1982, a man named Harold Bray, who was a sheriff in Jefferson County, Colorado, which is an area just west of Denver, arrived at the Denver airport. Harold was running late because his commute into the airport had been treacherous because Denver and the surrounding areas were all getting pounded by a snowstorm. After running into the terminal and getting checked in and getting through security, he made it to his gate right as they were boarding the plane. Feeling very relieved, Harold joined the queue of other people that were getting on the ramp to go down into the plane, and then just a couple of minutes later, he stepped on board and he found his seat, which was located at the front right side of the plane. He sat down in his seat, he buckled in, and then he grabbed an in-flight magazine from the back pocket of the chair in front of him, and he waited for takeoff. 15 minutes later, as the plane was rumbling down the runway at full speed, Harold looked out the window. So as the plane began to lift off the ground, he watched as the city lights of Denver slowly faded away as they got higher and higher up. But just before their plane entered into the thick cloud that was hovering over that stretch of Colorado, Harold noticed something very odd out of his window. Located just west of Jefferson County, which is where Harold worked, was a 22-mile stretch of road that cut through the Rocky Mountains. It was called the Guanella Pass, and it took motorists up and over this 11,000-foot mountain pass. Now, this was a beautiful scenic drive that Harold was very familiar with, but this road was not maintained in the wintertime. So if there was snow on the ground, you simply could not get through this pass. It was impossible. Yet, as Harold looked out of his plane window down to Jefferson County below and he kind of scanned his way west up into the Rockies, he saw there were clearly a car's headlights on the Guanella Pass. And so Harold's thinking to himself, why in the world would anyone be on the Guanella Pass in the middle of this huge snowstorm? It didn't make any sense. But as Harold watched this vehicle, he saw what was going on. Whoever was in this vehicle was holding a flashlight out of their window, and they were shining the light straight up into the sky, flashing it on and off, signaling distress. This motorist was trapped. Harold knew the likelihood of another plane happening to fly over this area and looking down and seeing those lights and recognizing them for what they were, an emergency, were slim to none. So Harold knew if he didn't act quickly, this motorist was doomed. And so Harold quickly got up from his seat, he climbed over the person next to him, he got into the aisle, and he waved down the attendant, and then after the attendant ran over, Harold explained who he was and why his experience as a sheriff told him that this was an emergency. And so the attendant took him very seriously. They turned around, they went into the cockpit, and they told the pilots, and the pilots used their radios to call down to authorities on the ground. And then just a couple of minutes later, the fire department was dispatched to Guanella Pass. 15 minutes later, the fire chief, a man named Dave Montoya, who was driving in a four-wheel drive SUV, arrived at the start of this 22-mile stretch of mountain pass, and as they're driving through the whipping snow, he sees up ahead the headlights of the stranded vehicle. And so he drives right up alongside this vehicle, which was a small pickup truck that had clearly slid off the road and gotten stuck in a big snowbank. And so Dave, he parks his SUV, he hops out, and he rushes over to the driver's side window of this vehicle. And inside was a terrified-looking 30-year-old man named Alan Phillips, who was a mechanic who lived in the Denver area. Now, at the time, it was the middle of the night, it's negative 22 degrees Fahrenheit outside, the winds are whipping, the snow is coming down, and Alan only had on a light jacket and some jeans and a small blanket wrapped around him. So, had Harold not spotted his flashlight SOS signal from the plane, it's almost guaranteed that Alan would have died that night from hypothermia. And so when Alan turned and saw Dave standing there, his rescuer, Alan began crying tears of joy and thanking God that he was going to survive. When Dave asked Alan what happened, Alan, who was slightly intoxicated, told Dave that he had gone out drinking at a bar, and then when it was time to come home, he had stupidly decided to drive through the Guanella Pass back to his home, forgetting that this particular stretch of road was not maintained during the winter. When Dave asked Alan how he got this really deep bruise on his cheek, he assumed he got it from crashing off the side of the road, Alan smiled a kind of embarrassed smile and said, "No, actually, after I got stuck, I needed to urinate, and so I got out of the vehicle and I walked a few paces away from my truck and I went to the bathroom, and then when I turned to walk back, the snow was so blinding I couldn't actually see my truck, and I ran to go find it again because I didn't want to be trapped out in the snow, and I ran into the truck face first, and so my cheek hit the door of the truck." And so Dave, he just smiled and said, "Alan, you are one lucky man." Over the next few days, local newspapers in Colorado and some national newspapers ran headlines about the miracle at Guanella Pass. However, as it would turn out, that headline would not age well. 38 years later, in 2020, it was discovered that Alan had lied to Dave about why he was in Guanella Pass. The truth was, earlier in the evening that Alan would eventually get stuck, he had murdered two hitchhikers near Breckenridge, Colorado, roughly 50 miles from the Guanella Pass. Both of these murders had gone cold, but in late 2020, DNA evidence connected Alan to both cases. Several hours before Alan got rescued, he picked up 22-year-old Annette Schnee, who was hitchhiking, and after she got into his truck, it's believed he held her at gunpoint and then put zip-tie handcuffs on her wrists, and then we don't really know what happened next, but at some point that night, Annette was taken out of the vehicle and led into the woods, and she was shot in the back, and she was left face down in a stream. A couple of hours after he killed Annette, Alan picked up another hitchhiker, 29-year-old Barbara Oberholzer, and when she got into his truck, it's believed he did the same thing. He held her at gunpoint and put her in zip-tie handcuffs. However, Barbara was able to break out of her restraints. It's believed she struck Alan in the cheek, which is why he got that deep bruise on his cheek, and then she leapt out of his car and started running. But Alan got out, chased her down, and shot her in the chest, killing her, and then he dumped her body off the side of this cliff down into the snowbank below. So the only reason Alan got stuck in Guanella Pass is because he was attempting to flee the area where he committed these murders, and he likely just didn't understand how dangerous this pass was, and so shortly after turning onto it, his truck slid off the road and he got stuck. In February of 2021, Alan, who was 70 years old at the time and still living in the Denver area, was finally arrested for these two murders, and he is currently awaiting trial. Assuming he did it, that Alan killed these two women, we don't know what his motivations were. It's not clear, he hasn't said, and we also don't know if there are potentially other victims. The next and final story of today's episode is called 5 Hacks. In the 1960s and 1970s, hitchhiking became very popular amongst young people in America. Hitchhiking is a form of transportation where you basically get rides from strangers. And so the way it works is a hitchhiker will stand on the side of a busy road and they'll extend their arm out and they'll kind of hold their thumb up, which signals to passing motorists that they want to hitchhike. That's the kind of universal sign for hitchhiking. And then a willing motorist, when they see a hitchhiker, they'll pull up alongside and offer a ride. Now, today, it seems unfathomably dangerous to just hop into a stranger's car or conversely, for a motorist to pick up a random stranger on the side of the road. But back then, this was considered totally normal and socially acceptable. And so with that in mind, on September 29th, 1978, a 15-year-old girl named Mary Vincent was standing on the side of a highway just outside of Modesto, California, which is not far from San Francisco, California. Mary was a rebellious teenager who had recently run away from her home in Las Vegas, Nevada. Her parents were going through a very nasty divorce and she just couldn't stand to be in the house anymore, and so that's why she had run away. And so she had hitchhiked all the way up to Los Angeles, California, where her grandfather lived. But after only being there for a couple of days, she became unbelievably homesick and wanted to go back and be around her parents and her family. And so one day when her grandfather was out, she slipped out of his house and she began hitchhiking back to Las Vegas, Nevada. And so she had hitchhiked from Los Angeles to Modesto, California. That's where the first person was willing to drive her to. And so she was on that strip of highway in Modesto looking for another ride that could take her farther south. She was on this highway with 2 other young hitchhikers. They all had these signs that said going south, so they weren't just holding their thumbs out, they were holding these signs. And so the 3 of them are huddled in a group, they're holding their signs up, and at some point, mid-afternoon, this light blue passenger van that only had 1 passenger, it was the driver, he was a 50-something-year-old man, he looked pretty harmless. He pulled over when he saw their signs, and he parked on the side of the road maybe 15 feet ahead of where they were. And so Mary's companions stayed where they were, and Mary ran up to this light blue van, and she looked through the passenger side window, which had been rolled down, and she asked this guy, hey, can you give all 3 of us a ride? We're going south. And this man, he would look at her and say, I can only give you a ride. I can't give the other 2 a ride. I can only give you a ride. And so Mary's confused because she's looking at this guy and she's seeing all this space in his van and she's thinking to herself, why am I only allowed to go when they're going the same place I'm going and there's plenty of room in this van? But when she kind of gently prodded this man and said, well, are you sure you don't mind taking them too? He just said, look, I will take you, I will not take them. And so Mary said, okay, well, hold on, let me go back and get my bag. And so he stays parked, she leaves the van and she runs back to the other 2 people she was with and, she explains the situation and they tell her, Mary, this is not good. There's clearly something off with this guy. But Mary, even though she too shared this kind of reservation about this guy, she was so desperate to get home. She was so homesick that she couldn't face the idea of having to wait around for another ride, which might not come until the next day or the day after, because not every motorist is willing to pick up hitchhikers. And she just did not want to wait any longer. And so she told her companions that, guys, I'm going to take the ride. And so she says goodbye to her 2 friends, she grabs her bag, and she runs back up to the van and she hops in the passenger seat. As soon as she sat down and closed the door, this man pulled back out onto the road and started driving, and then he turned and looked at Mary and introduced himself. His name was Lawrence Singleton, and he was 50 years old. And then Mary, she introduced herself, and then they have some small talk. And very quickly, Mary feels at ease around Lawrence. He kind of reminded her of her grandfather. He was very nice, very polite. And so when she started to feel tired pretty early on in their trip, she said, hey, Lawrence, do you mind if I doze off while you drive? And Lawrence would say, no problem, go ahead, go to sleep. And so Mary turned away from Lawrence and kind of curled up on the seat, and pretty quickly she was asleep. A little while later, when she woke up, she looked out the window and immediately could tell they were going the wrong way. So she turns to Lawrence and says, we're going the wrong way. And Lawrence would say, oh, you know what? I made a mistake. I'll get us turned around. Sorry about that. I had no idea. But Mary's thinking to herself, we're really far in the wrong direction. There's no way he accidentally did this, but she kind of bit her tongue because Lawrence would actually turn around and start going in the right direction. And so they're traveling in the proper direction for a little while, and Mary's totally on edge, but she's careful not to give that off to Lawrence because she doesn't really know this guy, and even though he did make her feel comfortable, she just doesn't really know what his intentions are. And so she's just kind of looking around pretty apprehensively, and then they pull into this stretch of highway that kind of ran through this fairly forested area where very few cars were on this stretch of road, and Lawrence suddenly tells Mary that he wants to pull over because he has to go to the bathroom. He wants to relieve himself. And so Mary kind of apprehensively says, yeah, okay, that's fine. And so as Lawrence is beginning to pull off of the highway, Mary happens to look down at her feet and she notices one of her shoes is untied. And instinctually, Mary just thought to herself, I better make sure that shoe gets tied because I might need to run away from this guy. But she didn't want to reach down and start tying her shoe. It was kind of awkward because the space was small and she was worried it would be kind of suspicious if she did it. And so she thought, okay, as soon as we pull off, I'll get out of the car and I'll tie my shoe. And so Lawrence, he pulls over, but he doesn't just pull over onto the shoulder of this road. Instead, he pulls into this access road that kind of trails into the forest. And so as soon as he turned onto this road, the alarm bells are going off in Mary's head. She knows something is wrong, but she doesn't really know what to say to Lawrence because he's not talking to her and she doesn't really want to look at him. And so she's just kind of going over in her head what she's going to do. Is she going to run? Is she going to confront him? She doesn't know. And then eventually, after about a minute or so, when they are far enough away from the main road that no one on that road could see them, they're pretty far into this forest, Lawrence stops the car and he hops out to go relieve himself. And immediately Mary, she hops out of the car too and she bends down to tie her shoe. Before she could finish tying her shoe, suddenly something smacked her hard in the back of the head and it knocked her unconscious. It was Lawrence. He had hid a hammer next to his seat, and when he had gotten out, he did not go relieve himself. Instead, he walked around the vehicle and smashed her in the head. When Mary came to, she realized she was laying down in the back of the van, and as she was looking out the windows, she could see that they were still parked out in the middle of the forest. And then when she tried to move, she realized her hands, her feet, everything had been tied down to the van. She couldn't move. And so as she's wondering what's going on, Lawrence comes around, he opens the back doors to this van, he hops inside, and he begins assaulting her. Mary has no idea what to do. She's a 15-year-old kid, and this guy is on top of her. He's not stopping. And so she just began quietly begging him to please stop, set me free. I won't tell anyone. She just kept repeating that over and over and over again, and Lawrence never spoke back. He just continued the assault for hours and hours. Finally, when Lawrence got tired, he got off of Mary and he climbed out of the back of the truck and he went around and he climbed into one of the front seats and he fell asleep. And so Mary probably tried to free herself from her restraints, but there was nothing she could do. The restraints were tied too tightly. And so for hours, she must have just laid there wondering what was going to happen to her. And then at some point in the middle of the night, Lawrence wakes up again. And without saying a word to Mary, he just climbs out of the van and gets into the driver's seat and then drives the van out of the forest. He drives on the main road for a little while until he turns down another access road that takes them away from the main road, so away from any prying eyes. And he comes to a stop somewhere out in this forest in the middle of this big canyon. Lawrence parks the van, he climbs out and walks around to the back. He opens up the back doors where Mary is laying there whimpering and crying and begging to be set free. He climbs inside and her torture continues for hours and hours until the sun finally came up. At which point Lawrence stopped. He climbed out of the back of the van and he's standing out there and he turns around so he's facing Mary and he reaches in and he undoes her restraints. So he frees her, he pulls her out of the van and stands her up on the ground. And so she's crying, she's beaten, she's bloodied, she doesn't know what's going on. And she just gently says to him, please set me free. And he says, oh, you want to be set free? I'll set you free. And so he walks around this totally destroyed 15-year-old girl and he reaches into the back of his van where there's this toolbox and he pulls out a hatchet. And so he walks back and he's standing in front of Mary, and Mary would have had a fraction of a second to see what was in his hand before, in one fluid motion, he reaches and grabs her left arm with his left hand. He grabs her on the wrist, then he raises his hatchet up and he brings it down on her left forearm, severing her arm off right below the elbow. And so Mary falls backwards to the ground and she looks down at where her left arm just was. She's in shock. And before she can do anything, Lawrence just walks over and with his left hand again, he reaches over and grabs her right wrist. And now Mary knows what he's about to do. He's still holding this hatchet. And so she's screaming and she's kicking him as hard as she can to try to get him off of her, but his grip is too strong. And then he begins to chop at her right forearm over and over again. It would take 4 hard blows to finally sever her right arm off of her body. And so Mary falls to the ground in a heap. She's bleeding profusely. She's screaming in agonizing pain. And all Lawrence can focus on is that one of Mary's amputated hands was clutched on to his left arm. When he cut off her left hand, it had gripped onto his arm and now it was stuck to him. And so very nonchalantly, he began trying to flick this hand off of his arm. And then finally, when it did come off, he turned and looked at Mary and realized she had gone silent and she was limp and she was laying in a huge pool of blood. And so Lawrence put the bloody hatchet back inside of his van, and then he just walked over to Mary and grabbed her and began dragging her. About 100 feet down the road from the van was a culvert. A culvert is a big tunnel that goes underneath roads. It allows water and runoff to pass by the road without damaging it. And so this particular culvert underneath this access road was built about 30 feet below the surface of the road. And so if you were standing on the road over the area where this culvert was, if you walked to the edge of the road on either side, there would be a 30-foot drop-off down to the opening of this culvert on either side. And so Lawrence dragged Mary all the way over to this section of the road over the culvert and then chucked her lifeless body off the side, smashing it down onto the rocks below. And then Lawrence walked around very carefully all the way down to her body and stuffed her inside of the actual culvert. And then as he was walking away, he said to her, "Now you're free." After Lawrence left, Mary should have been dead. Really, she should have died at several points along this attack. But miraculously, Mary did not die. And in fact, she would later say she vividly remembered the entire attack. She was fully lucid, fully conscious, fully aware for the entire thing, save for the moment when she was knocked unconscious by the hammer. And so she vividly remembered having her arms amputated, and she specifically remembered one particular point in the beginning, before her left arm, the first arm, had been amputated. He grabbed her left wrist, and she in turn instinctively grabbed with her left hand onto his left arm. So she's clutching onto him, and so when he came down and cut her arm off, she began falling backwards, but she remembered thinking to herself, why am I falling backwards? I just grabbed onto his arm. I had a firm grip. And then as she's falling, it's like time is standing still. She literally saw her hand still clutching his arm and saw it had been cut off of her body. And then when Lawrence cut off her right arm, despite being in agonizing pain, it's like she instinctively understood that she has to pretend to be dead. Otherwise, she will die. And so she went totally limp, her eyes were half open, and she watched as Lawrence is flicking her left hand, the one that she thought she had gripped onto when she was falling back. She watched as he shook that hand off of his arm. And then she was limp as he grabbed her and dragged her the 100 feet to the culvert. And she was limp and still and didn't make a sound when he threw her 30 feet down onto jagged rocks, and she broke 4 of her ribs. She was in excruciating pain, but her will to survive was telling her, make no sound, take this punishment, and you will survive. And then after he left, she remembers thinking, I don't know where he is. He could be waiting up on the road for me. I can't just crawl out and try to save myself because then he might actually finish me off. And so she laid in this culvert in this horrible position, totally contorted, with her arms gone and broken ribs. And then finally, after a while, she started to feel exceptionally tired, and that was from blood loss. And she said there was a voice in her head telling her, you can't go to sleep. If you go to sleep, you're gonna die. And if you die, we can't catch this monster, and he's gonna do this to someone else. And so she had this surge of adrenaline where she decided, I'm gonna live. I'm gonna get out of here. I don't know if he's still up there, but I have to get out and I have to try to save myself. And so somehow she got out of the culvert. And then once she was on the ground, she dug the nubs of her arms into the dirt and attempted to pack the wound with dirt and mud. And then afterwards, she raised her arms up over her head because she didn't want the blood and muscles to fall out. And so with her mutilated arms up over her head, she managed to crawl up this embankment up onto the road. She's got no clothes on. She's covered head to toe in blood. She's in shock. And she starts running down the highway. And a car would actually come by fairly quickly, but they were so startled at what they were seeing, they didn't stop and they drove on. And so Mary would ultimately run 3 miles on this highway before finally flagging down a passing motorist. It happened to be a young couple. And after they got over the initial shock of what Mary actually looked like, they put her inside of their car and they sped to the hospital. Mary would stay in the hospital for a month. And during that time, she would give police all this information about her attacker, about Lawrence Singleton, and using her very detailed description of him, the police were able to come up with a very good composite sketch. And Lawrence Singleton's neighbor happened to see that sketch, and they turned him in. Lawrence was ultimately sentenced to 14 years in prison for what he did to Mary. It was the maximum sentence that the judge could give. The judge wanted to do more, but legally they couldn't. And so Mary, she testified at court. And so after it all ended and he was sentenced, Mary was leaving the courthouse. And as she passed by Lawrence, it was the one time she had to be physically close to him, he turned and kind of leaned into her and said, "I will finish the job if it takes me the rest of my life." 8 years later, Lawrence was paroled for good behavior. And so, of course, this terrified Mary, who by now had become a wife and she had 2 sons. And so she's worried that now that this guy is free, he's going to come and finish the job. But Lawrence would not go after Mary. Instead, 10 years after he got out on parole, he would attack another woman, a 31-year-old mother of 3 named Roxanne Hayes. And unfortunately, he would kill her. At Roxanne's murder trial, Mary would actually testify against Lawrence, and her testimony is what they used to secure a death sentence for Lawrence. But before he could be executed, Lawrence died of cancer in jail in 2001. When Mary heard that Lawrence had died, she felt very cheated. However, her sons were very relieved to find out that her attacker had died, and so she took some solace in that. Outrage over Lawrence's early release, considering what he did to Mary, and the fact that that early release led to another person being killed, led to the creation of the Lawrence Singleton Bill, which gives judges the ability to give 25-year to life sentences in cases that involve torture. Meaning, under this bill, Lawrence would never have gotten out of prison after what he did to Mary.
We kept the sunset in our pockets, golden streaks beneath our skin, running fast through summer doorways, chasing days we couldn't pin. Our laughter caught in shining echoes, skipping like stones across the breeze. We didn't know what love could feel like, but it found us with such ease. And every heartbeat drummed in time with wild horizons in our eyes. We were burning bright as the sky, learning how to paint fire on the wind.
Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballin podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please invite the 5-star review button to be a part of your very fun, very casual neighborhood squirt gun fight, but then squirt the 5-star review button with sulfuric acid, not water. Also, please subscribe to the Mr. Ballin podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, Google, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories we have posted on our YouTube channel, which is just called Mr. Ballin. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username is just